I'm speaking from my Queen's Park office, which is located on the Treaty 13 lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. And as a settler on this land, I want to confirm and reconfirm my commitment to the truth and reconciliation process, especially including land claims such as 1492 Landback Lane.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the ISARC Religious Leader Forum. Usually we are at Queen's Park, and there's always a benefit for holding a forum there. We get to meet with politicians. We also get to see each other and to share information on what's been happening across the ISARC network. Unfortunately, because of COVID, we need to meet online. But the benefit of that is that today we're able to welcome people who perhaps would not have been able to join us at Queen's Park. In fact, we have some registrants who are from other parts of the country. And so we welcome you all today to our forum. During this last year with COVID happening, we have been doing our ISARC work a little bit differently, though we have continued to address issues around social assistance, legislation on housing, and long-term care. We've also spoken to the pre-budget hearings both in the spring and the fall. One of the lessons, though, that we have learned as we have been trying to do our work online and as we have seen the rollout of the CERB is the impact that CERB has made for so many people. People who are continue to be shut out, but people who got included because there was a political will on the part of the government to roll that program out. And so we realized that basic income is one of those issues that we really need to address because we believe that it is the right political moment now for us to be addressing that issue. So we welcome you to our basic livable income session today. You're going to hear from Lois Wilson, who is our theological reflector, also from Sheila Regehr and Jamie Swift, who will be introduced a little bit later. Today, as part of our forum, we have invited the different political parties in the province to bring greetings to us. And so periodically during our session, you will hear from either the leader or representatives of the leaders of the parties. I'd like to welcome Dolly Begum, who is representing NDP leader Andrea Horvath. She will be speaking to us from Toronto. Welcome, Dolly.
The topic was what actually made me realize that I wanted to join you today, just to say thank you and that we're with you in this fight, in this important issue, raising it in the Ontario legislature, but also at the federal level. We were actually in Parliament yesterday until midnight, debating, how the COVID response has been by this government, the chief medical officers, the data, as well as what's happening with the way the government has addressed some of the issues in long-term care, healthcare, schools, all of that. As the MPP for Scarborough Southwest, I know how important it is to make sure that we have a livable income for everyone. I have the highest child poverty in the riding, and the fact that we have young children going to school without breakfast, or during COVID, I can't even imagine for those who relied on school breakfasts or power snacks, what they might be going through at this moment, and what it means for a lot of single mothers, a lot of single parents who are relying on different types of precarious jobs to make a living, to put a roof on top of their head, and just to get by. So I was just listening to Susan talk about CERB and how it has given us a model for what is possible. I think it really takes a lot of political will, some ambition, but it is doable. And the most important part is we're already paying for it. Poverty is costly. The fact that we pay over $6,000 for per night for homelessness is astounding, and we need to do better. We need to do much better, and if we are managing the money properly, there is hope. And I think, you know, as I look at all of you and see the work that you're doing, I do appreciate how there are members from, you know, beaches, from Scarborough, and it really goes to show, I think, the dedication we have towards this issue. And I can promise you that my colleagues and I in the Ontario NDP believe in you know, the right to have a livable income, the right to have proper housing. This is a huge issue, and recently we put forward a plan for affordable housing for, you know, one day to imagine owning a home for yourself, to be able to rent in the area that you grew up in, but also what's happening with our elders was another issue. I'm sure you're seeing the news. I'm sure you have family members who may be affected. So I don't want to take too long, just to say thank you so much. It's lovely to join you all. My prayers with you all, and I do appreciate you giving me the opportunity to join you this morning. Enjoy the day.
Thank you, Dolly. It was great to have you with us. I had a chance just now to take a quick look at the chat box as to who is on our call, and what an array of advocates that we have. It's fabulous. I also noticed that the Reverend Dr. David Frimmer is on with us today, and I just want to acknowledge David as the first chairperson of ISARC, who was chairperson for many years with us and did an immense amount of work in helping us organize the coalition and continue to do work with us. So welcome, David. We're so glad you're able to join us today. I'm now going to turn things over to Lois. Lois Wilson is a religious leader ordained by the United Church of Canada in 1965. She has served pastorate with her clergy husband for 15 years, and then she moved to other aspects of ministry, becoming president of the Canadian Council of Churches, the first female moderator for the United Church of Canada, and president of the World Council of Churches. Lois was appointed as an independent senator by former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien. She has 4 children, 12 grandchildren, 5 great-grandchildren. That's information that perhaps you already know about Lois, but a couple of other things that you may not know. She is an author. She is a well-traveled speaker. She is a feisty advocate for human rights issues. And so today we are very, very pleased to welcome Lois as our theological reflector.
Good morning. I'm very happy to be with you to share my faith perspective and my theological convictions with you about the guaranteed livable income. I'm going to tell you a story from my faith community, because my experience with interfaith groups is that it becomes richer when people share their own faith traditions with others. And I'm sure that there are stories like this from other faith traditions, but I happen to be from the Christian community, so I want to share this one from the New Testament. Interruptions are very interesting. I don't know how many of you watched the vice president debate between Pence and Kamala Harris, but he was constantly interrupting her until finally she said, "Stop, I'm speaking. Pardon me, I'm speaking." And that shut him up, and he became a little more pliable, and they began a very good conversation. My point being that interruptions allow for new possibilities. Now, we're experiencing COVID, which is the largest interruption any of us have ever had in our lives. But to me, that holds out the possibility of new possibilities and new relationships. So here goes. The story I'm about to tell is really 2 stories, because it's one story inside another. Story number 1 is the story of Jairus, who was a Jew, a big man in the synagogue, and he sought Jesus out at the seashore. Jesus was busy with the street people milling around on the seashore, and Jairus, this very important man, went down to ask him if he would come to heal his daughter. he asked Jesus to lay his hands on her. So it was the laying on of hands, the ritual of healing that he asked for. And Jesus listened to him and then started off to go to Jairus' house. Suddenly, Mark interrupts this story with a second story, because it is a story. This is not biography. This is not history. This is a story. This is reflections on the meaning of Jesus by his early followers. So story number one is interrupted by story number two. And it is the story of a woman who has been menstruating for 12 years. And as a result has been isolated from her community totally. And we know in this COVID time what isolation does for people and for the deterioration of mental health. She's isolated, she's poor, she has nowhere to turn, and she has no community supports. She's barren, she's never born children, which is a no-no in a community that really valued producing children. So she's an old maid in that sense. And she's desperate. She'd heard that if she can get in touch with Jesus, if she can reach out and touch his talent, that is his prayer shawl, which is the symbol of liberation for the Jewish community since they were led out of slavery by Moses. If she can only touch his talent, that will put her in touch with the whole liberating tradition of the Jewish community. So she inches up behind him very carefully and slowly and reaches out and touches his talent. And immediately, the scripture says, she knew that she was freed of her trouble. What was her trouble? Was it her physical disease? Was it her isolation? What was it? Perhaps all. As soon as she touched him, Jesus knew that some energy had gone from him, and he turned around and he said, "Who touched me?" And there was silence for a while, and then the woman confessed everything and told him who she was and why she had touched him. Then Jesus turns to her and says, and this is a very critical verse in the whole story, "Your faith has made you whole. Go in peace. You are healed from your trouble." Now, there's various translations of it, but it starts out with, "Your faith has made you free, has cured you from your disease." What is faith? Well, a lot of people confuse it with belief. I once asked Ted Scott, the primate of the Anglican Church in Canada, what his understanding of faith was. And he said, "Well, I'll illustrate it for you. Suppose you go to Niagara Falls with some man who has a guy wire across the halls. And he says, I can walk across that falls on the guy wire and I won't fall in. Do you believe that I can do that?" You say, "Yes, I believe that." That's belief. But if he turns to you and says, "Get on my shoulders and I'll take you across," that's risk. That's faith. So Jesus says to the woman, your faith, your ability to risk, your ability to come out and touch my talent, that has set you free. Well, then the second part of the translation is interesting. Set free from what? Was it her menstruation for 12 years? Or was it her poverty? Was it her isolation? We don't know, and various translations of the Bible have different ways of saying this. But in any case, she was set free from isolation to be freed to participate in the full life of the community as a full member. Whether she ever ceased the flow of blood, we'll not know, but it no longer isolated her from the community and from social supports. Then he says, "Go in peace." Now, I used to live in Hamilton. I worked with the Jewish Community Center down the street, and I used to phone them and say, "Hello," and they'd say, "Shalom." And I felt like a barbarian because they were saying, "Go in wholeness, go in peace, go in wholeness," with full relationships established between us. Shalom, a beautiful word. So this was the message. The Gospel of Mark joins the two stories because the girl is 12 years old. Jairus' daughter is 12 years old, and the woman has the flow of blood for 12 years. So 12 is the magic number that's used here. 12 being a symbol in Jewish history of wholeness, 12 tribes of Israel, 12 gates to Jerusalem, and so on. So it means totality and wholeness. The two stories are linked. But right after this, story number 1 comes back again, and Jesus is still at the lakeshore. There's a message comes that Jairus' daughter is near death, or one of the Gospels has her dead already, but she's near death, and could Jesus come and help her and heal her and make her whole again? And so he goes with a great crowd, apparently, and when he gets to Jairus' home, he sends them all away because he wants peace and quiet. And he goes in with 2 of his disciples, and he takes the little girl's hand, again, the laying on of hands. And he says, "Get up, little girl." And she gets up. And then instead of saying, "Get down on your knees and thank me," he says, "Give her something to eat. She's hungry." And so she is restored to life again as well. Story of 2 women, Jairus' daughter and the woman with the flow of blood, who are rescued from being isolated, and they become full members of the community again through social supports and through their own risk-taking of reaching out. Well, why did Mark interrupt story number 1 with story number 2? I think the message is that those of us at the center cannot be made whole until those at the edge are made whole. There's a symbiotic relationship between us. And if that's so, what are the implications for COVID? I recently watched Steve Paikin on TVO's Agenda, and it was on COVID-19 and what was going to happen to people who had lost their livelihood because of it. And 2 or 3 of them kept repeating the phrase, "Well, there's not much we can do because the poor we have with us always." And they knew that was a quote from somewhere, but nobody could remember where it came from. Well, I was so mad that I sent Steve Paikin an email, and I said, "That is a misquote from the biblical book of Deuteronomy, which says, 'The poor you shall have with you always if you do not keep my commandments.'" And the commandment, of course, is to look after the poor and to look after that balance between the center and those at the edge. He wrote me back a very nice note saying he would never quote that again without quoting the whole thing. In any case, these stories are people at the center like Jared, like you and me, and people at the edge, students, the people who've lost their jobs through businesses, the indigenous people, the poor, who don't have a livelihood and cannot participate in the life of the community. They can't go to the art gallery. They can't go to restaurants because they don't have any money. They're poor and they're isolated. But the possibility of new relationships comes out of the COVID experience. And if we're able to shift priorities in Canada so that we can get the guaranteed livable income for those below 2,000 a year, 2,000 a month rather, then we'll have been part of a massive shift in social and economic relationships in Canada, as massive as Medicare was in the 1960s. The last push during the throne speech, the Senate people told me that they were cautiously optimistic about such a shift. I'm hoping and knowing that the faith communities will weigh in on this heavily now, and we'll keep at it. It's a marathon. It's not a short dash. So remember the story of Jairus and the woman with the flow of blood and the balancing act there, because Jairus was not free until the woman at the edge had been healed, had been included in full community. So interruptions are interesting because they pose the possibility of new relationships. We have that historic time in Canada now. And besides, it might be very good news for the poor. Thank you.
Thank you, Lois, for sharing that with us. We're going to move from having Lois address us, reminding us of the need for wholeness and interruptions that can be good for us, to having Sheila Regehr speak to us. Sheila is one of our 2 keynote speakers for today. She's the founding member of the Basic Income Canada Network, and she's been chairperson of that since 2014. She's a former executive director of the National Council of Welfare. Her 29 years of federal public service spanned frontline work, policy analysis and development, international relations, and senior management. She has expertise in areas of income security policy and taxation, with a focus on gender equality and race in particular. She's co-author with Chandra Pasma of Basic Income, Some Policy Options for Canada, 2019. So welcome, Sheila.
So I want to thank ISARC very much for inviting me and for putting such a spotlight on this issue, because it really is important. And I too really do see the kind of possibility now that the Reverend Wilson has talked about. I'm going to talk very much about the policy wonky bits of this. Jamie, who follows me, will likely be much more interesting, talking more about the human dimension. But in a recent webinar, I started out very philosophical and noticed that the chat room started filling up really, really quickly with very detailed questions about what is this thing? How does it work? How much money is it? So I'm going to get some of those details out of the way. So for the Basic Income Canada Network, our description of what a basic income is a regular government payment that ensures that everyone is able to meet their basic needs, live with dignity, participate in society, that's key, and regardless of work status. And I use the word work very deliberately. One of the issues that comes up in the basic income debate all the time is that there really is a difference between work and employment. And we use those terms as if they mean the same thing all the time, and that gets confusing. So one of the best ways I've found of understanding what a basic income is to look at examples of basic income like things and an example of what it's not. So in Canada, we're extremely fortunate that we have forms of basic income. So for seniors, for those who are 65 and older, seniors benefits provide that kind of income guarantee that has very few conditions. We also, interestingly, have a form of partial basic income for families with children. And what's important to note about that, we get back to the work debate again, is that it's not children who are getting the money, it's their parents. And these are the same adults about whom other people seem to worry that they're not going to participate in the paid labor force or that they're going to be irresponsible somehow. We've decided to trust seniors. We've decided to trust people with children. The question now is, are we willing to trust all the rest of us? The example of what a basic income is not is very clearly social assistance. So I don't need to explain to anybody here, I think, what a just horrible, humiliating, and inadequate system that is. But the other thing that we don't talk about so much that's not a basic income is simply neglect. And by that, I mean we have programs in place that catch people when they fall, when they lose unemployment, for example. But we don't do a very good job of supporting people while they are employed, while they're studying, while they're trying to get ahead. We wait till people fall and fall deeply, and then we pretend that social assistance is going to fix that. So the next question then is, you know, a little bit more about why we need it. And Jamie might talk more about this, and I'm not going to go into it, but I was mentioning to some people earlier in the chat room that the BICN board reflects a lot of the reasons why people come to basic income. So we have someone who's an expert in housing and homelessness. We have others who are working in high tech and artificial intelligence, and they see not just interruption, but disruption that technology and the changing economy has caused. We have people who are worried about poverty, inequality, erosion of this sense of the common good that underpins most faith traditions. We have people who are concerned about democracy and climate. So COVID, as others have mentioned, has really highlighted just how fragile our income security systems are and how full of holes they are. CERB and other response measures tried to fill some of those. They still keep changing. As things are getting worse this fall, people are talking about new measures, extending things, but in all of it, there are people left out. And they're not just left out by accident. Like, we know why they're left out. They have been excluded for reasons that we've tolerated for far too long, by assuming that poverty is people's personal fault through racism and all of those things. And what we are seeing now, and this came up in one of our earlier chat rooms too, is that we now have people who are in dangerous, low-paying jobs. We have people who are at risk of addictions. We are seeing growing use of food banks, homeless shelters, and a much larger and wider swath of people who are sort of doing okay, but are extraordinarily anxious about what the future holds. And I think that's a problem. They're really afraid of losing what they've got, and, you know, are fearing that things might get desperate for them. So this is where we are now in looking at the basic income debate. So the second part of my presentation then is looking at some of those details. What does a basic income look like in Canada in real life? Who gets it? How much is it? How much does it cost? Who pays for it? So I'm going to go through this fairly simply, I think, and not get into a lot of technical stuff, but it can get into the weeds pretty quickly. So the first thing to understand, and as so many people got interested in basic income, everybody started talking about it. Some things got very confusing. So if we get back to basics, there are two predominant models that we look at in the basic income world. One is often called a UBI, or in Europe they call it UBI. In a plain language word without an acronyms, we refer to this as a sort of demi-grant. This is what Andrew Yang proposed in the United States. It's a version where the same level of benefit is provided to everybody on an individual basis, regardless of any other income you have. The second major model of a basic income is what Milton Friedman and economists unfortunately refer to as a negative income tax. Terrible terminology for something that's really good. The way we refer to this in plainer language is that it's a guarantee. And this works like our healthcare system works. Our healthcare system is universal because everybody belongs to it, but you get the help you need. If you need medical treatment for a heart condition or a broken leg, you will get that. If you don't have those conditions, then you don't need that support. So basic income provides support to people when they need it. And this can be anybody throughout the life course. I mean, we all at times face challenges that make us more vulnerable to loss of income. Again, in Canada, we're fortunate. We have examples of both of these. In our seniors benefits, we have old age security, which is more like a demo grant. It largely is the same amount that goes to most people until you get up into the upper income brackets. And then the guaranteed income supplement is one of those rare programs where the name actually refers to what it does. So if OAS is not enough for you and other pensions that you might have are not enough, then based on your income, the guaranteed income supplement will bring you up to a certain level. So another couple of examples, people that I've spoken to talked about the Mincome experiment that was in Dauphin. And many people, of course, know and have been involved in the Ontario pilot. Both of those operated generally on a guarantee model. So we've got lots of experience with this in Canada. What the Basic Income Canada Network did was just this January, we released a report, the result of about 2.5 years of work, developing what national policy options might look like for a basic income that would ensure that everybody in Canada was covered. So we looked at how you design a benefit, and we go further than most other people, and we look at how to fund it, and fund it in ways that get the results we want. So this is really new. Most studies stop at how much it costs. And the way you pay for it also determines what the results are like. So we start, and the biggest challenge was at the beginning. We start with our principles. What are the principles behind the kind of basic income we want? And identifying that then determines the answer to every decision and every challenge we run into on the technical side of things when we're modeling. So to run through principles very quickly, we want it to be progressive. So those who need the most help get it. And then gradually, we don't want the middle class to pick up the tab. It has to be gradual so that those in the upper income brackets pay their fair share. We want to make sure that employment is rewarded. We want to prevent poverty. So our benefit level was designed at around $22,000 a year for a single person to make sure that happens. We want to reduce inequality, including gender equality. And all of these things that we've identified as our goals, we can measure to make sure that our principles are being upheld. Another key tenet was that we want to make sure that the basic income is understood as working in synergy with public services. So when we come to funding a basic income, it's not public services that are going to be part of that. We don't touch that as a funding source. These aren't trade-offs. We need both very clearly. So all of our models then look at our versions of the two basic ones that I talked about. So our option number 1 is for adults 18 to 64, because this is the major group that's left out in Canada, and it's a guarantee model. The second one is all adults, so it includes seniors, and it's a guarantee model as well. The third one is all adults with an individual demo grant model. Now, I'm only going to talk about one option, and I'll tell you why, but I want to stress that all of our options were designed so that they were feasible and could be paid for and had similar results, and they do, which shows that the design work of a basic income is really important. You can do it different ways. Policy option 1 is the one that I'm going to talk about, and the reason we kind of shifted very quickly from the end of January when we released our report was the same week that the first COVID case was identified in Canada. And then since that time, with the arrival of COVID and with, so much attention on as Reverend Wilson talked about, this was an interruption, this was a disruption, this allows a possibility to really do something. And we thought, we need to make a strong recommendation to government now. We're no longer neutral, pick your option based on what makes sense. It's option one now that is the most feasible. So that's the 18 to 64-year-old group, fill in this gap, provide $22,000 a year for a single person. It's about $31,000 for a couple. Each individual gets their own payment. Child benefits stay the way they are. Another important element of this guarantee model is that you want a gradual reduction of benefit. So only those people who really don't have much of anything else will get the full benefit. Other people who have some employment or other income will see their benefit gradually reduce as that income goes up. But we want it gradual. We don't want to cut people off prematurely. Part of this policy addresses poverty, but I think the bigger part even addresses insecurity. We want that security to extend up into the middle brackets. We don't want people to have to fall so far that they have to pick themselves up out of the basement all the time. It simply doesn't work. So now I want to talk a little bit, so that's the benefit side. Now I want to talk about the funding resources. And this is where things get a bit weedy, so I won't go into too much detail. But essentially what we do is we look at what's in the tax and transfer system already. We redesign and we fold in credits that are already there that are providing money to people through refundable tax credits. So like the GST credit. It's an example of a kind of basic income in that it's unconditional, it's pretty universal, it's widespread based on income, but it's very, very low. So those sources we roll into the basic income. Then we look at non-refundable tax credits. So the way these work is that if you have very little income, you're not going to get the benefit of these at all. Some people will get marginal benefit. And then we have a range of non-refundable tax credits that provide incredible tax breaks to people with lots of income who don't need them. We spend billions supporting higher income individuals in this country. We add to that a number of other tax fairness measures. One colloquially is called a buck is a buck. In our tax system, some kinds of income get preferential tax treatment compared to others. We don't think that makes sense. We make some changes to the upper income brackets, again, to make sure that those who are wealthier contribute their fair share and to ensure that corporations share. Of most interest to many people here is how we deal with social assistance income. This was a challenge to find a fair formula across the country, but what we do essentially is take the income part of social assistance, the money that would actually go out to people, we roll that into funding the basic income, and then we take a portion of what's left over that's administrative money. So this is like the kind of work that would go into policing social assistance. So we don't need that anymore, but we do leave money in the budget to provide for the kinds of services that are very often attached to social assistance recipients. So there is money left to adapt those social services to meet some other needs that are ongoing that are in addition to income needs. So my last little bit that I'm going to talk about relates to a graph that I'm going to ask Victoria to put up. And this is the results of option 1. So for those who need a little interpretation to fill this in, the gray line that descends, that's the basic income amount. So you see the maximum goes to people who have very little income right now, and then it tapers off gradually into the middle income deciles. The purple line is quite a very steep curve. This is an inequality curve. This shows you know, how steep it is at the bottom for people who have very little, and how really steep it is at the top. You know, once you're in that upper 0.01%, your incomes just skyrocket. What the basic income does, the green line, is flatten the income inequality curve. And we measure this through Gini coefficients, and we measure poverty reduction through poverty measures. And we can see that this option does those things and does them really well, especially for the people who need them most. So as this graph says, it provides life-affirming stability for those at the lower end. And I keep stressing, this is not a distinct population group. This can be any of us at any time. And COVID has revealed that far more people are vulnerable to falling into that low income bracket than we thought. It provides security for everybody and a little more help, but not a dramatic amount of help from those in the upper income brackets. If we found other funding sources, we could even do a better job of this. And I would also stress that one of the key benefits of a basic income is also the bonus is that it makes our whole tax system simpler, fairer, and more transparent, so we can all see what's happening with our money. So I'm now going to turn things over to Jamie. He's going to talk more about the politics on the policy front. For me, what I see as what's next goes back to what Susan was talking about in, you know, the senators saying that they kind of see a movement towards this. There is a convergence I see, not just in our models, but in different models that people are putting out. And what we've been hearing from politicians is that this focus on the 18 to 64-year-old age group needs to be a priority. A guarantee model is what makes most sense in Canada. That the benefit level is based on something linked to a poverty line. So this could be, you know, the CERB or an amount that we recommend. The Ontario amount was a little below, but it's arbitrary. Our current measures are arbitrary in social assistance. This makes it a non-arbitrary measure for a basic income, and certainly much higher than social assistance. And the final thing is what gives us, I think, the most hope is that what we have seen from the delivery of CERB is that our government has much greater brains and capacity to deal with, you know, meeting the needs in a very responsive way than we ever imagined. And this should give us hope. Our current finance minister, Chrystia Freeland, has written about the plutocracy and inequality. We would think a basic income should make sense to her. She talks about the ability of governments to have the authority, brains, and will to work in the interests of the community at large, even if they conflict with those of the wealthy and business. So I think what we see in Canada now is certainly the federal government has the authority to do a basic income. It has the brains to do it. We need the political will. Thank you.
Yes, we're privileged to have Jamie Swift, who's a Kingston writer, author, and activist. He was born in Montreal and moved to Toronto in the 70s. Throughout the 90s, he was a regular contributor to CBC's radio series Ideas, one of my personal favorite shows. He was a co-producer on a drama documentary, Till the Cows Come Home, about the fight to save Canada's prison farms. He served for 15 years as director of the Justice and Peace Office of the Sisters of Providence. He's held the Michener Fellowship for Public Service Journalism and is the author of a dozen books. The most recent, The Vimy Trap, or How We Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Great War with Ian McKay, was a finalist for the Writers' Trust of Canada's Shaughnessy Cohen Prize for Political Writing. And next spring, and this is a bit of a plug, he and Elaine Power will be releasing The Case for Basic Income, freedom, security, justice. Welcome to Jamie, activist warrior. Thank you.
Well, I don't know about the warrior. It stands in contradiction to the two previous books, but I'll take any plug I can get, especially for the next book. I came to be interested in basic income through the work that I was doing with the Sisters of Providence since 2003, I guess it was, maybe 4. And I was in that time involved with ISARC as part of the steering committee. Nearly 10 years ago, Bryce Balmer and I and Mira Deneen put out a book called Persistent Poverty, Voices from the Margins. So I've been to a lot of religious leaders forums. I've never been to a 2-dimensional one. So this is unique for me, and I guess it's not as unique as it should be. So it's weird talking to myself. So I thought I'd start off by saying that I should be teaching a course at Queen's this fall. For years, I taught a thing in the business school, which may seem counterintuitive. It was called Critical Perspectives on Business. And one of the characters I introduced in that course was a fellow who I always referred to as Uncle Milty. Uncle Milty, of course, I think Sheila mentioned him in passing in her presentation, is the famous neoliberal economist Milton Friedman. And he was a fairly savvy chap, responsible as much as any single individual for the neoliberal revolution from 1980 or the late 70s on, whose effects are still with us. So Friedman was not simply an economist, he was also a political activist. And if Victoria could put up the first slide, which is a quote from Uncle Milty from his 1962 book, Capitalism and Freedom. You can take a look at it. He was prescient. Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. So emphasis on ideas and ideas that are lying around. So Uncle Milty was a fundamentalist, not in the sense that he had a literal belief in some sort of a sacred text. When we think of fundamentalism, we usually think of some kind of rigid religious belief in a sacred text as an unquestioned truth. Uncle Milty was a market fundamentalist, and he had the simple idea that self-interest should drive all our activity, and that the market, self-regulating, unregulated market capitalism should be the way to go. Taxes should be low, especially low taxes for those on high incomes. And as I said, his sacred text is his 1962 book, Capitalism and Freedom. So if Victoria could go to the next slide, which is a continuation of Uncle Milty's insight. Excuse me. Come on, Milty. I know you're with us. The trick, continued Uncle Milty, is to keep your ideas alive until the politically impossible becomes the politically inevitable. So he talked about ideas and crisis and politics, and that's what I want to talk about briefly today. So I think today, as everybody will agree, and as Reverend Wilson suggested, we're living through a crisis that is beyond the experience of most of us with respect to the plague. We also, of course, this time last year, we were talking a lot about the climate crisis, and it's not going away. And I guess some of us would argue it's more important than the COVID crisis, but there you have it. So as Sheila said, recently, just before the plague hit in the early spring, the Basic Income Canada Network came up with their policy options paper, and she's explained it to some extent. It's available for those who want to read it on the internet. And that led to the idea, an idea that would have been seen as politically completely impossible, ridiculous even, weeks beforehand, the idea that is represented by the CERB, the Canadian Emergency Response Benefit. And that idea, we think the people who are promoting basic income represented a watershed moment, because all of a sudden it became the politically impossible, according to Uncle Milty, became politically an imperative. So I think what the COVID crisis, the plague as I like to call it, has shown is that the ideas dynamic has been affected. And an idea, the basic income guarantee, that's been lying around, in Uncle Milty's terms, for centuries, decades, and certainly centuries, people are paying more attention to it. So it goes back to Thomas More's Utopia. People who have been promoting basic income for a long time are often dismissed as utopian dreamers, or perhaps Tom Paine, the famous revolutionary of the late 18th century, early 19th century, and his book Common Sense. Tom Paine supported basic income, and those of us who are promoting basic income today see it as quite commonsensical. Basic income back in the 60s and 70s was known as a guaranteed annual income, again, didn't go anywhere, although there was lots of talk. Martin Luther King was a supporter of it as he reached the end of his life and his political career, and many others were, including Milton Friedman, which is something that makes the hair of many people on the political lefts catch fire. But of course, as Sheila explained, what Friedman was talking about and what the Basic Income Canada Network is talking about are two vastly different things. So we would argue that by 2020, the pandemic had ripped the shroud off the prevailing free market thinking that Friedman and others have been promoting and putting into effect since 1980 or so. And that's what we call, Elaine Power and I call in this book, market fundamentalism. So again, making it easy for many Canadians to collect $2,000 a month at a cost of many billions under the CERB would have been regarded as completely laughable. Certainly at this time last year, I mean, it would have gone nowhere. You would have been laughed out of the room, but all of a sudden it happened. It was politically possible. It's important, I think, to note, as Sheila and I think Reverend Wilson touched on, that the CERB and its associated programs does not benefit people who have little or no labor market attachment. So they're seen as still the undeserving poor. And I think that's something that one of the things that the basic income guarantee, the livable income, is aimed at, as Sheila explained in her presentation. So as far as this idea being a crazy idea is concerned, let's look back at other crazy ideas. So once upon a time, for nearly a century after Confederation, again, as Reverend Wilson touched on, public health care was not in the cards. But in the 1960s, a combination of politics and faith communities were very important in promoting Justice Hall's report, which led to a comprehensive public health care system in Canada. All of a sudden, we had it. Once upon a time, slavery was regarded widely as normal. At Confederation and after, only white men of property could vote. Votes for women were considered, somewhat laughable as well. Indigenous people were not allowed to vote until the early 50s. But social movements, together with the ideas that animated them, have animated us, I would argue, can change things. And what we're seeing now at this watershed period is we're hoping that they can change things for the better. Which is not to say that with the politics of basic income, there are not still big hurdles to jump over. Many people still see the idea of a basic income as crazy. All you have to do is read the comments section on any newspaper article about basic income, and the keyboard warriors will crawl out of the woodwork, or maybe they'll crawl out of their keyboards, and they'll say, well, if you give people money for nothing, they'll just, they'll do nothing. They'll just head for the couch and eat bonbons and watch video or soap operas, or perhaps they'll drink beer, which is of course worse than bonbons. And it'll just lead to an epidemic of sloth and lassitude. The Mincome Project in Manitoba in the 1970s, the basic income pilot in Hamilton, the results of those, and many other experiments in basic income around the world have shown that this is simply not true. That's not what the evidence says. Just before the plague hit in early March, I was in Hamilton, and McMaster University had put out a study along with the Hamilton Roundtable on Poverty Reduction. Our esteemed Premier Doug Ford had promised to keep the pilot project going. He famously changed his mind some 6 weeks after being elected. The McMaster study that looked at the very, very partial results for the folks who'd been participating in the basic income pilot in Hamilton showed that 3/4 of the participants who were working kept working, more than 1/3 of them moved into better jobs, and the study called basic income transformational. So I think we have to, this idea of people won't work is a zombie idea, that it just keeps rising from the dead. But you can't really get away from it. The idea that people are poor because they won't work or they're lazy. And of course, as former Senator Hugh Segal likes to say, most poor people, vast majority of people in Canada living in poverty really do work at one job and maybe 2 or 3. Another objection, of course, that Sheila has hit on is this idea of cost. So I think one of the metaphors you can use, and this is, I guess, the appropriate forum to talk about cathedral thinking. So what we have to do is think in the long term. Now, we know that politicians and business owners tend not to think what's going to be happening 10 years from now. But cathedral thinking, medieval cathedrals were funded by aristocrats who weren't thinking of this, great monument to their magnitude. They weren't going to see the finished product, but they had faith that there would be a finished product. So I think many basic income folks, boosters, as I like to call them, being fond of alliteration, basic income boosters like to talk about the social determinants of health. My colleague, co-author in this book, Elaine Power, thinks a lot about that, and it's been shown, the evidence is irrefutable, that poverty is a main cause of ill health, and if you eliminate or vastly reduce poverty, the costs to our healthcare system will decline. So cathedral thinking in the long term is really important. But I think politically we have to face the fact that poverty and social justice have never been high on the list of political priorities for any party. I, along with many of the people who are here with us today, banged signs into lawns saying, let's vote to end poverty. Over the past 15, 20 years, ISARC helped with a campaign to get people to think about poverty when voting at election time. We've been meeting at Queen's Park in the legislature for many, many years, lobbying politicians, and I think it's safe to say we haven't enjoyed stunning success. So poverty is not a ballot issue and is unlikely to be one. But I think it's important to note that in politics, self-interest can be a ballot issue, is a very important element in politics. How will I be affected? And I think as the plague has come along, in addition to somebody's 33-year-old son still living in the basement, or people, young people heading off to the bank of the parents, people, especially in the middle, the famous middle class, are starting to become insecure and anxious. And that insecurity and anxiety has been ramped up big time by the plague. And so what Elaine and I call in this book the democratization of insecurity may be providing a tipping point in favor of basic income. So there's a lot of signs out there. Senators Kim Pate and Francis Lankin got more than half the sitting senators to support a letter to the government in favor of basic income, right across the board, from Murray Sinclair, he of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, to Mike Duffy, he of the Cottage and PEI. So that was a big step forward. The BICN has lobbied 70 MPs in the last few weeks. The NDP rookie MP Leah Gazan has a motion 46 supporting basic livable income signed by 40,000 people. Keep that name in mind, Leah Gazan. It seems to me she's a rising political star here in Canada. The United Steelworkers of America have come out in support of basic income. That's the largest private sector union in Canada. Jagmeet Singh of the NDP has recently listed a guaranteed livable basic income as a party priority. There is significant support in the Liberal caucus federally, if not in the Prime Minister's office. The Green Party's long been on side. The Conservatives, of course, are wavering, but interestingly, this past month, the Canadian Chamber of Commerce came out and passed a resolution in favor of a basic income guarantee, interestingly put forward by the chambers in Hamilton and Thunder Bay, which were basic income pilot sites. So there is apparently some momentum towards this tipping point. And I think we have to keep in mind a broader political context of this free market fundamentalism. And I think that that's something that basic income can help chip away at. Manufacturing jobs have declined here in Ontario. The rise of precarious work is widely recognized. That gig economy, service sector work is under threat. Full employment, paid labor for everyone at regular hours, that has been a great demand of Social Democrats and the NDP for many years, is clearly no longer achievable if it ever was. You know, the idea of full employment, and I'm starting to diverge a bit here, but it's a famous hobby horse of mine. It's like those war reenactors who will head out shooting muskets around. They're sort of dreaming of the past as something that can be recreated. So is full employment a good idea at a time when we're in danger of frying the planet? This economy of endless expansion. In one article I read last year in the London Review of Books, prominent English novelist John Lanchester was supporting basic income, and his quote was hardly promising, but he asks, will we be fine with the rich taking a bigger and bigger share of total income until the end of time as the world drowns and burns and starves? So I won't leave you with that because it's too depressing. Basic income, of course, would not do everything to solve these staggering problems, but it is part of a comprehensive program that can challenge market fundamentalism because of its potential for wide appeal. The ideal of embodying the type of cooperative sharing ethic that underpins all the other socially necessary programs that Canadians enjoy. Affordable housing, formerly comprehensive, or we would like to have comprehensive childcare, pharmacare, labor protections, all those really important things like Medicare, as Sheila drew the parallel. So basic income provides the freedom from want that is essential for the freedom to imagine and create a different way of living together on the planet. So I'll just leave it at that. I hope I haven't talked too much. Thanks.
Thank you, Jamie, and thank you, Sheila. The two of you together, a tag team there, have really highlighted some of the technical things and the background and the challenges. At this point in time, we had intended to move to a bit of a question and answer, and I'm going to adjust our agenda a little bit. The Green Party leader, Mike Schreiner, is with us, and I'm going to call on him to bring greetings to us. And then I'm going to move us to a few minutes of break. And then when we come back from our break, we'll have a few minutes in plenary for some questions, and then we'll be moving to our breakout groups. So Mike, welcome. We're happy to have you with us today.
Thank you, Susan. And I'll give everyone time to think about their questions now after those two fantastic presentations, which it was an honor to listen to both of them. And I want to thank ISARC for inviting me to join you. This is one of my favorite events every year. And I want to take a moment just to thank ISARC for the amazing work you're doing, especially during this challenging year, moving a lot of your faith work online. And, you know, my heart goes out to the thousands of people in this province who are currently experiencing grief as they mourn the loss of a loved one. And the largest number of those deaths, unfortunately, have been in our long-term care homes. And my heart goes out to our elders and their loved ones. And that's why I've been calling on the government to prioritize care over profits, to fund a minimum standard of care, to make sure our loved ones can access justice, to hold the most negligent long-term care homes accountable. And I know ISARC has been very strong advocate on this issue, and I want to thank you for that. You know, this pandemic, as both Jamie and Sheila pointed out, has exposed the tragic holes in our social safety nets. And now more than ever, we need a basic income. And so I'm so glad you're focused on that. The Green Party, both provincially and federally, for a long time has been advocating for a basic income guarantee or a guaranteed livable income. And we need that now more than ever. It is the simplest and most straightforward solution to keeping food on the table and to make sure no one falls through the cracks when the next emergency hits. And we know that our social safety nets have been broken for a long time. A big segment of our labor force doesn't qualify for employment insurance. Social assistance rates in Ontario for people on Ontario Works and ODSP are cruelly low. And during the pandemic, I'll just say that it was wrong to claw back those benefits or not to top them up to the CERB rates. We know that the application process for social assistance is a painful one, weighed down with delays, unnecessary complications, multiple forms, a lack of dignity, and a complete power imbalance. And you know, the Ford government talks a lot about removing red tape. And if they were serious about removing red tape, then the government would remove the red tape that the poor experience each and every day, especially for people trying to access disability support payments. And a basic income guarantee removes this red tape. It removes the stigma of the process and restores dignity to our most vulnerable neighbors. And so I was proud in the last provincial election, the Green Party of Ontario put forward a fully costed platform to roll out a basic income in Ontario. We supported the previous government's basic income pilot. And from my perspective, the basic income pilot was always about how to best implement a basic income, not whether to implement a basic income or not. And so I was so disappointed when the Ford government canceled that program. And Sheila, it was just an honor to work with you at Queen's Park, speaking out against that. And so I say, you know what, let's implement a basic income to provide the urgent and efficient solution we need to eliminate poverty. Let's get money in people's pockets immediately so they can pay the rent, keep the lights on, and put food on the table, which will make our local economy stronger and benefit small businesses and local businesses. And while we are figuring out how best to implement a basic income, we need to increase social assistance rates now to support people on ODSP, Ontario Works, and Gains so that people can live in dignity. So I don't want to keep people away from asking Sheila and Jamie the questions that that you want to ask, and I need to get down to question period. So I'll just end by saying, thank ISARC for just the tremendous work that you do, and to just let you know that you have an ally in the Green Party, and don't ever hesitate to reach out to my office if you need advocacy, support, and work here at Queen's Park to promote the good work that you're doing. So thank you for inviting me to be with you today.
Thanks, Mike. Really appreciate it. And you have been very faithful in joining us at ISARC forum events and bringing greetings from your party. Unfortunately, at this point, we do not have any representatives to join us from either the Conservative Party or the Liberal Party. One of the chat questions that came up while Jamie and Sheila were speaking was, what do the speakers think social community and faith groups can do to advocate for change at local, provincial, and national levels? So I'm going to leave that question with you, and we're going to take a break now for 10 minutes. So please come back in 10 minutes and we'll continue the conversation. Hello, everyone. We're back together again. Hope you enjoyed the break, short as it was. Perhaps we could start with the question that I saw in the chat box just before break, and maybe ask both Sheila and Jamie to just weigh in for a short bit on their thoughts about doing advocacy.
Briefly, our Kingston Action Group for a Basic Income Guarantee, when we started out in 2013, we were able to get the City of Kingston's City Council to unanimously support basic income, which is very good, but largely symbolic, of course, because you get, right-wing city councilors and left-wing city councilors and people in the middle all agreeing, because it's not going to cost them anything. So that said, it's important to recognize that symbolism is very important in politics, and if many municipalities across the country signed on to basic income or reiterated their support in the case of Kingston, that would be a good thing. I think faith communities getting behind it. I mentioned in my presentation that faith communities were instrumental in pushing for public Medicare in Canada in the 1960s, in the aftermath of the report, the Royal Commission report, Justice Emmett Hall. So I think united voices, or many faith voices in support of basic income, would also be very important.
I would echo that. And the question was, or one of the questions was, there are a number of them there that are really interesting that I was watching. Sort of what level, local, provincial, national, federal, where should we focus? And I think my answer to that is everywhere and all of the above. And part of it depends on individuals and who you are and who your connections are. So Jamie obviously is part of this Kingston group that has been a really powerful and motivating force for lots of people across the country. So there are local basic income groups in places to link up with. Many provinces have their own regional organization and are doing work. Many of you, it appears to me, are quite familiar with politicians, both at provincial, territorial, and at national level. So, any way that you can get to politicians and help them understand that people will vote for them if they come up with this idea, and almost why wouldn't you want to be part of something this iconic, this important at this moment in history. The other thing that I thought was really interesting, a couple of experiences I've had recently, when the Liberals announced, the federal Liberals announced that basic income was the top agenda item for their policy convention, apparently the Chinese press in Toronto exploded. So the Chinese community organized a basic income workshop in Chinese with translation to talk about this issue, to answer their questions, to figure it. So that reached a very large group of people that represents a strong voting contingency. So people who are part of other groups of larger people to get this issue out, I think is important. Municipal level action, many people here are from Toronto. So there are a couple of connections here. When we talk to the member of parliament for the riding that includes the Jane Finch area, which is, you know, heavily impoverished, racialized, struggling kind of area. We asked the person we spoke to in that riding office if they have been hearing about basic income from that constituency. And the answer was no. And on the other hand, I know that there are people, including Chris Glover, who is a representative in the Ontario legislature. He's been working with people in that community on gun violence. People in that neighborhood have clearly identified the time pattern that shows that the guns came in when the money went out. So the reverse can happen in that community. With a basic income, our lovely mayor in Toronto can stop going to the federal government asking for more money to combat gun violence. He should be going to the federal government saying, our city needs a basic income so that we can get rid of the need for gun violence. So I think at every single level of government, there are pressure points. COVID is putting enormous pressure on municipalities and provinces. I don't think our movement has yet put sufficient pressure on those levels of government to get them to pressure the federal government. So I think all of this, there are so many ways in which people can make a difference.
I just wanted to add to what Sheila, her comprehensive answer. I think people could go to the websites of the Ontario Basic Income Network and the Basic Income Canada Network and join those organizations. This is a social movement that has virtually no institutional support. Our base is not extremely wide. I would argue that support for basic income is in some way a mile wide and an inch deep, so that the more people who are getting behind these organized efforts to promote basic income, the better.
Thanks, Jamie. I'd just like to field a couple questions that have come through. There was an earlier question here from Ruth Duick Mbeba. To what extent can this coalition leverage the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives or Democracy Watch, for example, to influence policy reform and build political will?
Yeah, I think that people and faith communities that support the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, the Broadband Institute, and such like social democratic formations could put pressure on those organizations whose support for basic income has been at best lukewarm. So I think there may be signs of change there, but I think that those kinds of lobby organizations from the vague left need to be pressured to get on board this.
Jamie had talked a little bit about some of the left being nervous. And this is true of many of these organizations, that they have been lukewarm or they've been on the fence, they've been a bit tentative. I think COVID has helped move many of them off the fence. But I think in every organization, and this includes political parties too, it's fascinating. And I have a political science degree, but that means nothing about my understanding of politics. But it seems that within the rank and file of so many organizations and within the population in general, there is almost an instinctive understanding that basic income makes sense and they support it. Leadership is really different. So, you know, supporting parties at the grassroots level and at the rank and file level to help them influence the leadership of their organizations, I think, as Jamie mentioned, with CCPA and broadband types of organizations, that's really important.
Great, thanks. We have another question from Lorna Weigand. She says, I have heard that there is a fear that there will be more under the table work if there is a guaranteed income. Can you speak to this belief?
I don't know if that's easy to quantify. I think there's already a fair amount of activity in the gray economy. And as precarious work has mounted, that will only continue. So my gut sense is that if a basic income came along, people may well feel less inclined to participate in the gray economy. But that's just right off the top of my head. I can't, you know, provide citations to scholarly articles about that right now.
Yeah, and my answer would be similar. I think one of the things that a basic income does do is allow people to find options and ways of working in its fullest sense that include managing the care of your children or elders in your household, that manage participating in community level activity, manage in participating in the paid labor force, whether that's the formal labor force or what we refer to as the underground economy. The way the economy is changing makes all of these categories really fluid and kind of amorphous now. There are a lot of people doing an awful lot of legal, above board work that's not getting captured as that. So the perfect example, and you know, don't quote me on how all of this works because I have no understanding of much of the technology that goes on. But, you know, there's gig work that people do where you're paid to produce a certain amount of research or, you know, a short task. And you get paid for a certain amount of that task, but you don't get paid for all the preparatory work that goes into it, all the research that you've done, all the background that you've dug up, all of the contacts that you've had that allow you to respond to that task that is going to pay you for 5 minutes or a half an hour of work. It does not represent all the work that you have legally done, but doesn't get captured. So this whole question of how the economy might unfold, it'll be interesting to see, but it's no reason to stop a basic income. It's all the more reason for us to have the ability to respond to economic change.
Our breakout rooms are focusing on the questions around advocacy, congregational work. How do I move my congregation to see this as a priority? Looking for extra information or personal stories. So that's the third part of our breakout rooms, in addition to talking to Jamie and to Sheila. Talking about support, there are a number of faith communities that are on record and have been for some time supporting livable income. And so in our conversation, we don't want to admit acknowledging that so that folks don't think that that's something that we missed. We know there's support there. It's about building that support and perhaps broadening it so it's past leadership and into right into the mainstream of faith communities and for action, not just tacit support, but looking for ways to advocate that. While we're waiting for to move to the next breakout room, maybe we can just get comment from the three groups that just met to give any feedback from what they heard in their breakout groups. can I call on David Frimmer? He was in the session I was in, if he's got anything to say from that session.
Yeah, we had a very good conversation about some of the technical questions about cost effectiveness of basic income, whether or not the Liberals were really committed to it. So I think there was a question of, are they really walking it back? I found that was my question. I found that quite helpful. I think some other people asked about local connections to groups in their area that they could help to push it forward. So it was very helpful. Sheila was very effective in raising and informing us on a kind of number of aspects of this that we hadn't covered to date. So thank you.
Thanks, David. And the other two groups, I was in Sheila's group. So in Jamie's group, is there someone who can speak to that?
Yeah, so I took some notes on that. It sort of fairly swiftly went into advocacy and touched on the Christian work ethic that seems to mitigate against just giving money away for apparently no good reason or no work, which is interesting. The idea of advocacy going around people's stories, because the picture of poverty is stuck somewhere in the mid-Victorian age, I guess. And so trying to change that with people's real stories and share those. The importance of actually physically writing a letter, which is now rare. And so that has a bigger impact than Twitter and those kinds of things. One of the things that mitigates against going further deeply into basic income is the complexity of the style of the different flavors. But I suppose there was an undercurrent of we should settle around at least one style and promote that. The timing of making an impact was also raised, and it was appreciated about the idea of tax fairness within the system, within the basic income system. That's a big plus, and also the idea that the old age security is already a basic income format, and so we should just extend that. That was pretty much it.
Thanks, Colin. I know Murray McAdam was in the breakout room for stories, and I'm wondering if Murray has anything to share.
Yeah, I do, Susan. We had a powerful outline of the obstacles to employment that people with disabilities can face. We heard from Louise in our group, who's really determined to work, and yet the employment support programs, of which there are lots, simply were not that helpful for her. And I guess what was a really powerful story to hear from Louise was she was working at a call center in Kingston. The drivers for the bus that provides transportation for folks like her went on strike. So Louise drove her wheelchair 11.5 kilometers each way to get to work during the strike. She would get up at 4 a.m. in the morning, and at the end of all, and then when she got to work, even the physical arrangements that she had to face there were hard, and she was eventually told she didn't need as much support since she was able to get to work on her own. Just almost hard to believe, but her determination to rise above her circumstances was really amazing to hear.
Hi, everybody. We're back from our breakout groups, and delighted that Kathleen Wynne has been able to join us, representing the Liberal Party. And I should say, Kathleen's not just representing the Liberal Party. Kathleen has been a supporter and a participant in ISARC for some time now. And we also know she's very active in her faith tradition. So welcome, Kathleen. We're delighted that you can be with us today.
Sorry. Hi, Susan. Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I wasn't a planned appearance, but you know, invitations and technology being what it is, I got here. So I appreciate it. Susan, do you want me to say a few things now, or what do you? I'm not sure what stage you're at.
Please bring some greetings and and whatever else you want to say.
Okay. Okay. Well, first of all, as I always say to ISARC, thank you for what you do. Thank you for the conversations that you have. I think it's so important that there be people who are vigilant on these issues and who continue to bring them to elected officials. So thank you for doing that. You know, I will say that right now, from our party's perspective, we're putting together our policies. We're trying to react to and comment on, obviously, what the government is doing. We're very concerned about a number of issues, and I can come back to that. But we are also preparing for what comes next, because obviously, since the election in 2018, there have been changes that we think are pretty devastating to people. And I know you're looking at some of the issues around the Residential Tenancies Act, and people who are struggling already and who are going to be worse off given some of the continued changes that this government is making. So on the issue of the basic income, because I know that's what you are talking about today, obviously I was devastated personally, and as a former leader, I was devastated that the basic income pilot was canceled. I really had hoped very much that we would get some data, some evidence from that pilot that would allow us to move to make really significant reforms to our social assistance system. It's sadly ironic that COVID has shone a bright light on how necessary it is for us to do just that, to find ways to better support people, not because as individuals they need support, although that is a big part of it, but so that our communities can be healthier, so that we can have a stronger fabric. It was interesting in the group that caught a few minutes of discussion, the difference between labor and work, and labor being a commodity and work being the things that need to be done in our community. And one of the conversations I remember having with my policy team when we were setting up the basic income pilot, you know, I have this vision, or had this vision, that if we had a decent social assistance system, if we had figured out the basic income, there would be all sorts of work that has been traditionally done by women, that has been done by caregivers, that has been done by people who care about their community and want to make it work, that could be expanded if we had a decent income support program. And that is not frivolous work. You know, that is the work of helping seniors. It is the work of creating art. It is the work of helping families who are struggling with little kids. You know, there are all sorts of things that need to be done in our society that either get done because there is the right mixture of people at a particular time in a particular community, or don't get done because that doesn't exist. So we need a more systemic approach to those community supports. So I was personally devastated. I think, however, that because of this bizarre situation that we're all living with right now, I think there is an opportunity for the conversation to be renewed / continued. You know, I think that there are more people, because there are more people who have been on the CERB, for example. There are people who understand that their work is more precarious than they thought it was, maybe. And so I think that there is an opportunity to certainly push at the federal level, but I would suggest to push at the provincial level. I don't think this government's going to do anything, but I think whoever the next government is, certainly if the Liberals form power, form government, then we will obviously be taking up that thread and figuring out what the next steps should be. That would be, I hope, work that ISARC would push us on, and really be clear about what needs to be in the platform about how we are going to move forward on this. So you certainly have my commitment that I will continue to work with my Liberal colleagues. As many of you know, I'm not running again, but that doesn't mean anything. I'm still going to be talking and pushing. So I did before I was elected, and I will after. So I hope that we can continue to work together on this, whether it's through our churches, our faith groups, or whether it's in the political realm, because we have, I think even with the 2 years of the pilot, and now with what we've gone through for the last 8 or 9 months, I think it's much clearer what we have to do going forward. So thank you again, Susan. Thank you for letting me say a few things. And I don't know if people have any questions that they want to ask me about what we're doing, but we're trying to hold the government to account at this point.
It's just about the basic income, the pilot that you had. One of the things, if I understood it correctly, was that disability-related expenses like wheelchair repairs, catheter supplies, medical supplies, dressings, all that, because they were all different benefit amounts that were individual pieces on the ODSP program, they weren't going to be covered individually anymore. It was supposed to be covered within the whole overall income special, the basic income amount. But some of the things I'm not sure whether it was taken into consideration is how big those costs can be. And I know when I lost a job on ODSP on this program, what I found was really discouraging was when I lost the job, I didn't have a special diet allowance. I didn't.
Right.
All my medical supplies did not count as an eligible expense. So I literally, because I had over $100 a month to buy certain medical supplies, I just went hungry. I had no choice.
So Louise, that those kinds of details and adjustments, that was exactly what we would have wanted to look at when the pilot was done, right? Because we did make some adjustments in terms of benefits, because when we first put out the call, people on OW and ODSP didn't want to sign up because they were going to lose drug benefits and so on. So we did make some adjustments initially, but had we been able to finish the pilot, we would have looked at, okay, what was the net loss or net gain for people? Because from my perspective, there had to be a net gain. And if that wasn't the case, then we would have had to work that out.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
That was a rather short time for us for the third breakout room, but we have been trying to honor time, knowing that people make other commitments when they plan to be on a Zoom call. So we're not going to have a lot of time at this point for really too much wrap up and feedback, but we will ask that the folks who were taking notes in each of our breakout rooms would add that to the material that we're collecting from today so that we can put out something quite comprehensive for all the folks who have been participants. Part of our planning each year out of the forum is to look at the year ahead, and particularly as we prepare for the pre-budget presentation that we usually participate in. So as you consider the political landscape, please do identify some things that you think are really critical for ISARC to be giving voice to this year, as well as some other advocates that we could be connecting with, because that's also really helpful to us. So we do look to our participant base of the coalition to give us ideas and substance around issues. And I mentioned at the beginning that the Stories project that we've been working on, we're hoping will be available this spring as we finalize the stories, delayed partly because we were looking at the impact of COVID and going back to some of those folks to hear how COVID has affected them. our steering committee that does the work for ISARC between meetings and has been mentioned by Kathleen and others, help prepare presentations and speak to politicians and policymakers. I just want to acknowledge that steering committee today. Imam Hai Patel, Alexander Wilson, Colin Bain, Danny Bourne, Eileen Goulden, Imam Irshad Osman, Jamie Swift, Murray McAdam, Ryan Friedman, also Rabbi Shalom Schachter and Rabbi Jordan Hilfman were not able to be with us today, but they were also active in the steering committee. So I just wanted you to know if your faith tradition is represented there, that's great. And if your faith tradition is not represented, we are always looking to expand the interfaith membership that we have at the ISARC table. So please let us know if there should be someone else that should be joining our coalition and helping participate in the work and the conversation. I want to say again, a real thanks to Natasha and Victoria for taking us through the process today, the technical process. This is the first time we've done it online. Maybe let us know in the chat box if you find that helpful. I'm sure people don't want to give up the time at Queen's Park either, but it may mean that we do both in the future, do an online forum as well as a time at Queen's Park. So on that note, thank you everybody for being with us today. And we look forward to hearing back from you.